The provincial situation, and then the second half does the district overview of the municipalities. As HD said, we could speak for days on this presentation. We can go district by and municipalities in terms of their economic design and so forth. And they also are complemented by socio-economic profiles, which do it at a local municipal level. So this presentation tries to take a bit of a zoom back. We look at the different districts and we compare them, which is also very interesting, I think, for our work. And to do that, I'm going to ask Ms. Nadia Rinquist from the Local Government Budget Office to take us through the presentation.
Thank you so much, DDG, and good afternoon, Chair and members once again. My name is Nadia Rinquist. I'm the project coordinator for the Meadow in the Treasury. Today, I'll be taking you through this presentation very, very briefly. The Meadow is over 1,000 pages in total, but I will do that in 10 minutes to give you just a high-level overview of what the Meadow is about this year. So the key messages that we see emerging from the Meadow this year, we're working on the theme Governing for Growth, as our Minister mentioned when she tabled our Meadow this morning. We see that the Western Cape and the municipalities are rebounding in terms of post-lockdown. We see some growth happening, all coming off a very low base that happened during COVID. And we see that while we see the GDP growing, we don't see the jobs catching up yet. We still see a huge loss in jobs. We have challenges that we're facing in the province and in the country at the moment, the energy challenges that we face on a daily basis, as well as other challenges with the port and other infrastructure challenges. We foresee that we might have another technical or a real recession in 2023, and that will require important tailored enterprise support to the province to avoid another recession. And then we still see inequality increasing due to the jobs that was lost and the unemployment growth during COVID in 2020. Moving to the next slide, as our DDG mentioned, the Meadow this year, yes, it is 6 books, lots of new innovations in the Meadow this year. One thing that you will see if you have your hard copy or your soft copy, if you go to page 2, there is a little QR code, as well as at the top of all the infographics, the QR code. So if you don't feel like carrying your books around, you can scan your QR code, you take your phone, you open it up, you go to your camera, you scan it on the QR code, and you click on it, and it will take you to the online link for the Meadow or the Pero or any of our other socio-economic publications. So that's very nice. You don't want to carry the 6 books around. It is a lot of books to carry around with you. Then section A will give you an overview of the province, as well as the infographics for the province. If you're not into reading much, you can just look at the pictures. The pictures are very beautiful. And if you go to the second half of the book, you will find the West Coast District, and it will give you a infographic on page 50. If you look at your West Coast book, it will give you an infographic of all the stats in the Meadow this year. So it's pretty much tailored for anybody that finds the Meadow or will find this data interesting, not just for municipalities, but for private sector, for education. I mean, I showed it to my 60-year-old mother, and she was very excited about it. Not because she's my mother, but because she found the data interesting. And she said, her comment was, this should be handed out in all high schools as a textbook, because it's so informative for anybody wanting to buy property, for anybody wanting to invest in a certain municipality. If you're thinking of relocating to an area, thinking of sending your child to a school in the area, the Meadow will provide you with all that type of information for your district. So moving on to the next slide, the Meadow, yes, as I mentioned, is in 6 books. We do have new information. We've always tried to innovate the Meadow every year. We've included new data sets this year. One of the data sets we use comes from the West Grow Tourism app that you'll find in your chapter 1s of your Meadow. That's on the ground data of tourist data that's collected via an app by West Grow. We also have the housing study done by our colleagues at Environmental Affairs and Development Planning this year, where they are surveying the status of housing in each district. They've only done it in 2 pilot districts. We're hoping to roll it out further for next year, but we have it in the Winelands as well as the Garden Route at this stage. I can tell you the state and the availability of housing within that district. Then we also have public sector expenditure on designated groups that you'll also find in Chapter 1. That's related to how the public sector spends the money on small business and entrepreneurs and how tenders and procurements allocated. A lot of it to Black-owned businesses as well as women-owned businesses, which is very interesting. We have detailed data on gross fixed capital formation this year, as well as an update on the COVID vaccination status. And then we also have some data from us in terms of the number of taxpayers in the Western Cape this year. Now moving into the detail of what the Meadow tells us this year, Chair. I'm going to go through this very fast, so everybody just needs to bear with me. I can speak really fast, so just keep with the pace. The Meadow is also broken down to align to the Provincial Recovery Plan in terms of economic growth, job safety and well-being. So the books are aligned to that structure. Moving to our first slide, we see that in terms of regional GDPR performance and sectoral performance, the Metro having the largest contribution to the province, followed by the Cape Islands district. On the right side, you'll see the regional sectoral contribution. We do see that we have had a decline in the trade contribution this year to 14.8% from 17.9%. This obviously affected by the tourism sector that had experienced a contraction, the largest contraction during the COVID-19 pandemic. Moving on to the next slide, GDP growth per district. We see that the metro's growth is slower because the metro is the largest economy within the province, and other municipalities grow from a smaller base. So you will see coming through smaller regions having larger growth compared to a bigger metro. But the trend over the last 10 years shows that pretty much all the districts follow the pattern of the province's growth, and we've had over the last 10 years shocks to the system, such as load shedding, a deepening drought in 2017. And just to note that we were in a technical recession before COVID-19 began. It was worsened by the pandemic. The pandemic caused a deep contraction to the regional economy, but now we are seeing a rebound. But this rebound will be affected by other further shocks to the system, such as load shedding and any other infrastructure shocks. Next slide, please. In terms of regional growth over the last 5 years, we see that there are sectors that are performing well, usually in the Western Cape, the agriculture, forestry and fishing sector. It's one of the strongest sectors in terms of performance because there are many regions that have a large agricultural base. We also see that the biggest contractions were found in the construction sector that was closed down during 2020 due to the pandemic and is still struggling to recover from the pandemic. Next slide, please. In terms of local real GDPR growth, over the last 5 years, the municipalities that have performed the best during the last 5 years of this data set is Cederberg, Swellendam, and Theewaterskloof, and the ones that are not performing as well are Knysna, Bito, as well as the Overstrand. Those are the worst performing munis. In 2021, we have estimated data. So we have found that coming off the rebound, the Cederberg, Swartland, and Bergrivier are the municipalities. Next slide, please. That have the best performance. And then the bottom three, we see Knysna, Mossel Bay, and the Cape Metro. So that's not to say that they are not growing, they are just growing at a slower pace than the top three municipalities. Moving on into forecasted data for 2023, we don't see a lot of positive, we don't see a lot of strong growth happening in 2023. As you can see, the metro is only forecast to grow by 0.2%. And then the highest growth we foresee happening in the West Coast district, mainly because they are export-led in terms of agriculture, normally fishing and mariculture, and we see investments into the sector in the West Coast district. Next slide, please. In terms of international trade, the Metro gives you information in terms of the trade balance of the Metro and the 5 districts within the Western Cape. This slide speaks to the top exported product as well as the top country that imports from the Western Cape. So for each district, you will see the countries that import the largest amount of products from the Western Cape. Yeah, next slide, please. This speaks to our tourism section, and we do see a recovery in the tourism sector happening. Is not quite back up to pre-pandemic levels, but we do see bed nights up in each of the districts. We see a lot of more tourists in the Overberg region as well as the West Coast, mainly because of migration as well as the Zoom culture, where people are working remotely and choose to live in districts close to the city but outside of the city. And that's causing the numbers of tourism to increase. We also look at, next slide please, the economic opportunities that each of the metro and the districts presents. And these are the sectors that are open for investment, that are attracting lots of investment and growth into those districts. Not surprisingly, in the West Coast, you'll notice the battery energy storage system and green hydrogen pilots. Those are positive developments that are happening in the West Coast district as they transition to a natural resource dependent region. Next slide, as we look at jobs, this looks at the employment contribution per sector. The key takeaway from this slide is that labor intensity of employment in the non-metro areas highlights the importance of the agricultural value chain. That means that the agricultural sector plays a huge part in provincial job creation, which is very important, but also concerning as we move into a more industrial society as to the skills levels of those employed in the agricultural sector, whether they will be carried along or whether they will actually be left behind. Next slide, please. In terms of the unemployment profile, this picture doesn't look good. Unemployment is still very high within the province, even though it's the lowest within the country. We saw the change in employment. We lost about 196,000 jobs in 2020, and we've recovered somewhat. We've recovered about 120,000 jobs in 2021. However, we are still down 70,000 jobs compared to prior to 2020. Next slide, please. This is looking at the comparative advantage in terms of employment. And what we use here to determine the comparative advantage is the location quotient. And this is looking at the level of specialization of various sectors in each district. And you'll notice that most of the districts, except for the metro, has a high location quotient in the agriculture, rural forestry and fishing sector. This means that if you have a location quotient above 1, that you have a strong advantage in those sectors. We noticed that, which is expected, the metro having its highest location quotient within the finance and real estate and business services sectors. And then just to point out, the Karoo has a location quotient in the general government sector, saying that a lot of people are employed in the government sector in that region. Moving on to safety and well-being, and this is the third chapter of the Meadow. This looks at all the socio-economic indicators for the district in terms of population size and growth. We notice that all of the areas are growing, some at a faster rate than the other. As I mentioned earlier, the highest population growth rate we're seeing in the Overberg, in the West Coast, as well as in the Cape Metro. Next slide, please. In terms of education, our grade 12 retention rates our retention rates between grade 10 and 12 are increasing across most of the districts and the metro, except for the Central Karoo. This means that students that enter grade 10, only 62.1% of them in 2021 have completed grade 12. Then in terms of the matric pass rate, we also see that increasing, and you will see then that the Central Karoo has a high matric pass rate, but in terms of data, they're only counting the 62.1% that, actually finished matric. That's how the numbers counted. So a 62.1% of the total number of students, meaning that a lot have dropped out between 10 and 12. Okay, and then next slide, looking at the well-being, the health indicators, infant deaths, all of these are pretty stable. There hasn't been much change in terms of infant mortality. We do see that the delivery to teenagers rates have increased, especially in the Central Karoo as well. In terms of inequality, while I mentioned earlier that the GDP is growing, we are seeing the money that's being made in a smaller pocket of the population, and that means that the gap between the rich and the poor is getting wider. And so in terms of Gini coefficient, which is a measure used to measure inequality, we still have one of the highest in the world, and the pandemic job losses have accelerated this inequality. In terms of the HDI, what's interesting to note this year is that for the first time, HDI has declined across all regions. Usually HDI goes up in the Western Cape because of government support to indicators such as health, education, and GDP, the ones that are used as indicators to measure HDI. However, due to lower incomes per capita, due to the pandemic, we do see that HDI for the first time is declining in the Western Cape. On this slide, we have access to basic services. Next slide, please, between 1994 and 2021. And just positive to note that a lot of residents in the Western Cape is receiving high levels of access to basic services, and that has increased significantly since 1994. Moving on to safety, crime per 100,000 people. The occurrences and instances of reported crime in this province are higher than national rates, meaning that people report more crimes. So the data could at times be skewed. Could also be that nationally some crimes are underreported, but we noticed that drug-related crime is the highest in the Overberg district and the Cape Metro, and drug-related crime is the one indicator that is increasing. As I mentioned earlier, next slide please, we have some new data that we've included this year in the Meadow. I mentioned the housing market study. And if you look at the housing market study data, it will point out that there is significant excess demand for affordable and entry market housing. The study is conducted in comparing George and Mossel Bay, as well as Stellenbosch and the Paarl, Wellington and Bequeni area. And all the findings of this studies point out that there is an insufficient supply of entry-level affordable homes, and there's an oversupply of properties in the high-end luxury market range. Next slide, please. And other new data we've used is public sector spending on designated groups. As I mentioned earlier, there's some lovely data on what demographic the actual public sector funding is being spent on. And a lot of it's being spent on the youth, and then a lot of businesses, as well as at least Black-owned businesses and businesses owned by women. Next slide, please. So in terms of the Meadow and the clients of the Meadow, the local municipalities, we also look at the so what. It's nice to have all the pictures and the data and everything, but what does this mean for municipalities? And so we provide some policy options in terms of what areas need to be looked at in local government in order to grow. And then these are some of the policy recommendations. Obviously, the economic conditions, the job losses, the load shedding, that will possibly have a negative impact on household income, which will affect municipal revenue. We also look at the energy supply constraints, and then also the above inflation, the electricity increases that we need to drive the energy sustainability and supply and implement and promote renewable energy initiatives. Next slide, please. And then we see rising socio-economic vulnerability, the increase in the teenage pregnancies, the high levels of crime. There's definitely integrated provincial and municipal action and targeted intervention needed to address those issues. And Chair, we see the Meadow as a key input for evidence-based decision-making to feed into IDPs, spatial development frameworks, local economic development strategies, and for budgeting and policy planning. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nadia. I mean, I can't overstate, Chair, in conclusion, that last bullet that Nadia highlighted around the role of understanding things at a district and a municipal level. So one of the things, for example, that's happening in the health department is they now very systematically look at vulnerability, and as Nadia highlighted, there are very different trends in terms of need at a municipal level, and that will reorient the entire way we spend our healthcare budget, for example, because it just flags to the health department that there's a need in a particular part of the province. Make sure that we allocate resources in that direction. So that will be part of the briefings as we come to budget. We can talk a little bit about it in the MTPS because it's sort of already starting to filter through. But also, as you can see, there are also different education trends by province. Also, one of the strategies the Department of Education is doing is how do we make sure that we have the right teachers in the right places as the province is very naturally developing. So the interesting thing about it is that growth is in very different parts of the province, making sure that we are delivering schools and hospitals to where they are needed. So it's a very important publication in terms of our overall thinking, and it feeds directly into the MTPS and the budget process.
Thank you so much. Welcome to the Minister also. I'm going to give the Minister's opportunity for introductory remarks before we start the next presentation, should you wish, even though I do acknowledge that you did table a whole speech as introductory remarks earlier today as well. So please do not repeat the speech as we do have it. But we're going to jump straight into the next presentation. I do not expect members to have read 1,000 pages in an hour and a half. So please do expect that members will come back to you. The committee will likely come back to you. I do not believe that Member Fry has read 1,000 pages in an hour and a half, but he's welcome to prove me wrong. I'm sure that the various different committees on the respective topics will also be much more interested in delving into some of these topics in more detail. Thank you so much. Minister, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. My apologies for having arrived a few minutes late. As you said, I've spoken enough today, but I think the main point is that we would like the mirror to be used as a tool to help inform not only your oversight work, but also the government's planning and so on. And so we'd really like the committee to be able to engage with it, not only this committee, but all of the standing committees, and we hope that it will be useful in your work as well. Thank you.
Chairperson, I think you want us then to jump straight into the next presentation, and this is an integrated presentation where we're going to provide the committee with information on second quarter financial and non-financial performance for the 22-23 financial year for Western Cape Government, as well as then the adjustments estimate that the Minister tabled today. Also for the current financial year, and then an overview as well of the medium-term budget policy statement. Although the Minister gave a very good overview of the key matters there today. Again, I think we've tried again very hard to both keep this brief but give insight into what information is available, particularly to enable the Budget Committee on its oversight role, but on spending in year, but also to prepare obviously for discussions in committees on the individual votes. So in the presentation, we're not going through everything, and there are some annexed slides, and I think that the various presenters as they go through this will speak to those areas, and obviously we can take questions and provide further information as needed for the committee. But with that, I'll hand over to Dr. Haverman again.
Thank you much, Eddie, and thank you much for the introduction. So a lot happens today. There is a quarter two, there's adjustments budget, there's a MERO, and then the MTPS, and this slide tries to say how they all link together. So if you think about it, and as you saw when we did the first quarter non-financial and financial information, which was linked to the PERO, there's a very close link between what the province is trying to achieve and how we think about the budget. So we look at the non-financial and financial information. We look at spending performance for the first half of the year, and that feeds in directly into the adjustments budget because we make adjustments to the budget to make sure that the thing works. So that gives you a sense on the third bullet of the first response to both in-year risks as well as the anticipated fiscal outlook. It also makes sure we achieve in-year fiscal sustainability by responding to risks such as service delivery challenges, energy crisis, etc. And we'll explain how we do that in the adjustments budget. And then from that, that allows us then to do our first estimate of our planning over the next 3 years, which is sort of the long-term budget, which is what we table in terms of the MTPS. So they kind of link together very nicely, and the presentation sort of does it quite systematically like that. And to give us a start on the quarter one non-financial information, I'm going to hand over to Ms. Annelies Pick.
Thank you. Chair, as indicated in terms of quarter two, we're just going to remind ourselves that in terms of the quarterly performance reporting, we are on this journey of integration, as we indicated to you in quarter one. And what we are looking at every quarter is in terms of approving that integration. So that report that you would have got for the performance report, which is now becoming quite lengthy, trying to give as much information, but in integrated fashion that you'll see that per department we now able to give you a picture from performance and from a financial and a non-financial perspective per department, including its public entity. So we've deepened that from our quarter one report. But for this round, in terms of the second quarter, what we're going to be providing you is in terms of just an overview from a socio-economic trends for the Western Cape for the second quarter. Also in terms of the performance delivery trends, that information, the detail of that, we've given a lot more detail this time around, but as indicated by the HOT, that we put that as annexures, and then we'll give you an overview of the financial performance because it feeds into our response in the adjustments budget. And then lastly, in terms of some trends regarding jobs and safety and well-being was also in the report. So for the quarter two is really about taking stock in terms of what we have achieved as a government for the first 6 months of the financial year, then in terms of what do we need to respond to, what we need to strengthen, both in terms of non-financial information, but also in terms of, from a fiscal perspective, how we actually then make sure that we are sustainable for the rest of the 6 months of the financial year. So we'll go into, first of all, in terms of just a brief overview of what those performance information looks like.
Okay, thank you, Annelies, for that introductory commentary, and just to speak about the picture through the lens of how Provincial Strategic Implementation Plan and the outcome indicators. The previous session referred to the recovery plan, and it refers to the lens of job safety and well-being now in terms of the mirror. Very much provincially, and taking a provincial overview, and then we look at where we stand with gross domestic product growth rate for the Western Cape was about -0.5% during the Q2 for 2022. If we look at the number of people employed, it increased by 2%, and then we look at official unemployment rates to that 27.5%, while the pro definition was probably about 31%. But having said that, those are three key indicators that actually drive that evidence-based policy decisions that needs to be in this economic space. Looking at safety, just a few key indicators is about stabilization in violent crime, with homicides in the Western Cape decreasing by 0.2%. And then we look at our 11 priority areas in the Cape Metro. It recorded actually no increase in homicides. This accounted also for about 43% of all the homicides in the province. But having said that, there's about 21% increase in the number of sexual assaults presentations at public hospitals compared to the last year. When one look at well-being, which is very much also closely linked to that safety, 75.7% of grade 1 learners receive formal grade R education in public ordering school. Then it's about the needs, age 15 to 34, that has risen 6.4% since Q2 of the previous of 2021. And then 14.6% of the children born in government facility weight under 500 grams. And these are critical indicators that present a picture of the socio-economic trends of the Western Cape, but very much through the lens of the Provincial Strategic Implementation Plan. Thank you. Looking closer to Western Cape government and service delivery, and how we respond to those broader socio-economic trends. If one look at the overview of the provincial performance, and one look at the performance data that has been validated, overall there's about 449 of the 536 targets, which is about 84%, and that were achieved. If one look very much only at the department specific, then one can see that 373 out of 448 targets, that's about 83% that were achieved. Not forgetting our public entities, 76 out of our 88 targets, and that equates to about 86%. But when one look at an overview of the provincial departments, the performance indicators, then one see that 373 out of 480 targets, there you could see it's 83. 2 of the 13 departments achieved all their targets, and then 47, which is actually only 10% of the Q2 targets, were partially achieved, and 28, which is 6%, were not achieved. When one look at the different clusters, one can actually see the government cluster actually performed about 93%, social 77%, and economic 83%. And one look at through the lens of the public entities, slightly different story. 76 of the 88 targets were achieved. 6 out of 11 public entities, and then 8 out of the 88 targets were partially achieved, while 4 were not achieved. And the government cluster actually achieved all targets, social cluster 86 and economic cluster 83. So what does that mean? So what we are doing now, also in part of our reporting transform journey, while we're looking at the different socio-economic trends in the province, what does the PSIP say, and what does all the APPs collectively say? But one also need to look at our trend and our own quarterly trend analysis of our performance. If one can do it with employment, with unemployment, or with GDP, then one need to look at one's business performance, one as per institution, and then look at how did we perform last quarter in the same year, and how we are achieving in the current quarter, or even how does one achieve in the current quarter of the existing financial year and compare it to a current quarter in the previous financial year. So in this slide, something different that we have presented before. You could see the two bar charts. If you just look, and then you could look at the aggregate line, and one can actually see the grey in terms of the achievement in the quarter one, and then the green, the achievement in quarter two. Then one can actually see nice, this almost equal or progressively and improve achievement per department. Here and there you could see a slight decrease, that the green is slightly below the first quarter. And sadly to say that my department of the Premier is slightly lower the green to the grey. I need to be very biased in presenting the data. So, and then one could actually see Treasury a slight increase, education equal, and docks also kind of equal, agriculture slight increase. But interestingly, one also could see the departments actually below the graph, below the line. Thank you. In terms of the public entities, similar picture, different nuances. Quarter one, you could see 82%, quarter two, 86%. So nice comfort in terms of quarter two, actually a slight higher performance, and one could actually see a few entities just below that average. Thank you.
So when we look at the financial resources that was utilized in order to achieve those targets that Zenit has indicated to us, for the second quarter, you'll see that we have spent about 47.1% on average for the different departments in terms of our budget. But also in the second quarter, we have votes that were showing in terms of some pressures, but we also have votes that were showing in terms of some potential and projected savings. Now, there are reasons for that. When you look at in terms of the majority, in terms of making up the underspending, aggregate underspending projected of 281 million rand, at that stage, at the 30th of September, Health was showing a 468 million rand projected underspending. Now, this is mainly because in the 2022 budget, they received funding. Part of the funding was for COVID, and as we do know that the COVID take-up is not as we would have expected in the main budget when we made that, when the allocation was made, and therefore they were starting to show in terms of that kind of potential savings. And then in transport and public works, that they were showing pressures. Some of those pressures are the liabilities that they have around, for example, the Go George project, but also there were other projects that were showing pressures in terms of the data hub, and then also from the eMerge projects that they have in terms of asset management within the department. Then also in terms of the next slide, which looks at the economic classification. So that same amount of expenditure of the 36 billion rand that we spent as of 30th of September, the projections then on the different economic classifications become quite important in terms of some of the decision making in the adjustments budget. So you'll see that as at COE, before the wage agreement was decided upon, you'll see that we were showing underspending and a bit of savings on compensation of employees. You'll also see that capital assets, which is really infrastructure spend, was sitting at 39% of spend as at 30th of September. And there was projected savings also shown at that stage in terms of the 30th at the first 6 months of the financial year, which this influences some of the principles around the adjustments budget. On the next slide, then, very similar to the performance information, we're also showing you in terms of the blue graph indicates in terms of the current year spend as at the 30th of September, but it's also the grey graph is showing you the spend for the same period, but in the previous financial year. So when you look at those two periods, you can see that there was already some votes that were showing some pressure, meaning that they were spending already in this year way more than what they spent in their in the previous year. And you'll see that is around social development, human settlements, environmental affairs. So you can see that those are the votes that were quite tight already in terms of their spending in terms of the first 6 months of the financial year. When we look then into the infrastructure and we zoom in on that spending, average spend for infrastructure was around 39%. And so you'll see in terms of the line going across that in terms of that's the average, it's representing the average, and you'll see which of those departments then are below that average spend, meaning education and health, as well as in terms of environmental affairs. So, and that is mainly in terms of the driving that 39% spend as it on capital as at the 30th of September that I indicated earlier. So the challenges around the infrastructure spend is about in terms of the delayed procurement processes, also then in terms of poor performance by the different service providers, and then there has been mitigating steps that has been put in place within the second quarter, but also then you'll see the response from the adjustments budget around this kind of spending. When we look at then individually, on the next slide in terms of the departments, and you'll see then that education as at 30th of September spent about 35% of their budget, health 25%. Those were the bars in below that average, if you remember on the previous slide. And then also I mentioned environmental affairs. There was also below environmental affairs at 33%, and then also public works at 38%, which makes up the average of the 39%. So in terms of the project pipeline, in terms of the projects for the second quarter, so there was a total of 585 projects within the quarter, and then the majority of that, as we would expect, as in terms of pipeline projects for infrastructure, majority is in the planning phase, the design phase, and then also the tender phase, and then 27% is in terms of the construction. As we've also promised the committee in the quarter one, we've given the detail per department where this is concerned, both in terms of category of spend as at the 30th of September, but also the project pipeline, the status of those projects. We've included that as the annexure. So we're moving on now in terms of the adjustments budget. How does the adjustments budget then respond to this quarter, but also then overall, what is the positioning of the adjustments budget? So in the key principles of the adjustments budget is really in terms of for us to achieve in-year fiscal sustainability. So to respond to where we found ourselves in quarter two, and those projections that we were showing in quarter two, it's to address the in-year pressures that were also indicated in quarter one related to the higher inflation rate. We just saw now that has been increased again. And then in terms of the energy crisis, the global supply chain challenges, as well as the public service wage increase. So the funding of the public wage increase is then also in this adjustments budget. We are then also providing some of the commitments that the departments have especially where they were showing in terms of some pressure, commitments of the previous financial year, and that is in the form of rollover, but then also in terms of the overcollection of revenue. Then it's also to position the departments to prepare for the 2023 budget, but also the decisions that they're making in this year, if there's any carry-through impact, to make provision for that impact over the 2023 MTF. And so this adjustments budget really becomes that first response in terms of the MTBPS, and to position the departments where that's concerned in terms of for the future to come. So for this then budget, in terms of the numbers, Paul, if we can just go one back, if you don't mind. So just to remind ourselves, so this adjustments budget builds on that main budget that we've tabled of 77 billion rand. We're adding 490 million rand in this adjustments budget, and also that these individual allocations per department, is to remind ourselves, they net effect of additions and shifts away. So pluses and minuses within a vote. The column 2 that you see, the adjustments, is a net effect per department. And so that then we're adding that to the budget, to the new adjusted budget for this year of 77.8 billion rand. So the next slide then says to you, in terms of how is that adjustments budget funded? So where's the funding coming from for the entire 490 million rand? So majority of it is coming from underspend in the previous financial year. So almost 57% of this adjustments budget is funded through rollovers, both from a conditional grant perspective, and then also in terms of making sure that the infrastructure projects in terms of to continue to finalize those infrastructure projects that we didn't in the previous financial year, but we're making sure that they can continue. So that's about of 278 million from rollovers of underspending of the previous financial year. In the previous financial year, we also over-collected on revenue. And that is mainly in terms of motor vehicle license fees that we over-collected, and therefore the majority of that funding of that over-collection is for transport and public works. Then there's also increased own revenue. So in the current financial year, our motor vehicle license fees is indicating in terms of that we are collecting more than what we have budgeted for in the beginning of the financial year, so that we've also increased for transport and public works from that perspective. Then in terms of for the Department of Human Settlement from the Asset Finance Reserve, there's 34 million allocated. 60 million is allocated from provincial financing, and that is in terms of health and education property acquisitions. That is in terms of the reserve that we put in place in terms of in the main budget for property acquisitions that the department is now in allocating for property. Then we also responding to food relief, as in terms of the minister's speech earlier this morning. In terms of institutional refresh, there is an allocation also of 4 million, and this is for integration and change management that is required for the institutional refresh. This is in terms of the new votes that we are looking at forming in terms of the 2023 budget. So it is that change management that needs to happen within those departments. And then also in terms of design of a transport voucher scheme to the value of 2 million is being funded. So as I indicated, as part of the principles is also positioning departments in order to prepare for the 2023 outlook and the MTF, and also then for them to realign certain of projects, especially the bigger projects, where they now implementation is not as perhaps planned, and for various reasons. So some of the departments are giving funding back to the fiscus, and that's realigned over the MTF. So that's the 155 million decrease you see. I indicated that this adjustments budget also then funds the wage agreement, but the allocation in the adjustments budget for the wage agreement is 51 million, and I will explain in terms of in the next slide why it's only 51 million that we are allocating for the wage agreement. And lastly, in terms of a conditional grants, there is a decrease for the National Health Insurance grant, which is a correction that we need to make on behalf of the National Department of Health that made an incorrect allocation in the main budget. in their main budget when they tabled it in the beginning of the financial year. So as I indicated, I'll come back to the 3% wage impact. So continuing in terms of our prudent decision making around COE, and the Minister also expanded in terms of our COE strategy for the province. And so what we've done in this adjustments budget is the fact that we first took the position of departments into account, the Q2 position where we are. I take you back to one of that slides that indicated your economic classification. We were showing about 248 million rand projected savings on COE. So what on COE, and that's why we took the entire vote, each of the departments where they found themselves, not only with the COE spend, but also their projected spend within their baselines. And if there was any, let's say, funding available, we made sure that they were funding the wage agreement then yet from baselines before we added where departments required. So this means we took a differentiated funding approach. Only those who required funding and that would impact in terms of our fiscal discipline at the end of the year, those are the votes that we then funded. And so the impact that you would then see in the adjustments budget is the fact that most of the votes were able to absorb the 3% wage agreement. And you'll see then in the book itself that the wage agreement within votes are then shown and reflected as shifts within the vote or shifts within programs. So you're not necessarily going to see an allocation. So those votes that do receive an allocation for the wage agreement are three votes: social development, human settlement, and environmental affairs and development planning. So to the value of 51 million in total is what we are funding. We have received from National 954 million, but we're only allocating 51 million of the 954 million that has been gazetted by the National Treasury. So what is left then of the 954, you'll see in that slide, indicates in 903 million, and that 903 million is then carried over into the 2023 MTEF process. One of the reasons for this is also in terms of the speech that indicated the uncertainty around COE at this stage is forcing us into 1 year budgeting, and therefore as much as we can help ourselves out in the next financial year, that is what we're trying to do. We're trying to maintain our COE strategy of keeping ourselves tight. We are trying to make sure that we are utilizing whatever's in the baseline of votes to cover that COE before we add to votes. So it's continuing that process. And then on the next slide, the impact then on infrastructure. So also in terms of that economic classification, I highlighted that it was 39% on infrastructure as at the 30th of September. So then how does the adjustments budget then respond to that kind of spend for the first 6 months of the financial year? And so you'll see that overall a net effect on infrastructure, there's a 30 million rand decrease on overall on the 10 billion rand that we voted in the main budget. And the detail that you will find is on the budget on overview and provincial and municipal infrastructure. And then the detail per project and per department is really from page 37 onwards. There's 60 pages in this book that gives you detail of the various projects and how they are impacted. When we look at our category of spend for infrastructure, so that same 30 million, what is it impacting in terms of the kind of investment on infrastructure? You'll see that in terms of the shifts that the department then has done, is the fact that mainly is in terms of maintenance and repair, that has been reduced. And then in terms of non-infrastructure, mainly within the Department of Health, what they've done is they've shifted some of their funding in terms of from existing infrastructure assets. They've shifted that to non-infrastructure, which is really in terms of their health technology plans, that they have increased the projected spending where that is concerned. So the detail, like I indicated, is in terms of from page 37 onwards from from one of the publications we've tabled. All in all, that is then the adjustments budget with a final lens, then looking at the 490 million is how it responds to the priorities. So growth for jobs of the 490, 242 million is in terms of for the growth for jobs priority, 66 million for safety, 110 million for well-being, and 71 million in total for governance, which then makes up the total of 490 that we're adding to the main budget. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. So that gives us the basis for which we go forward into the planning for the MTBS. So that's the presentation we'll do now. Chair, I think we all know the economic overview. We covered this in the Pero, we also covered this in the mirror. So I won't bore the committee with telling you how bad the economy is, except that obviously the last bullet point on the far right-hand side of the bottom is now incorrect, because while we were sitting here, the Reserve Bank has increased the repo rate by 75 basis points from 6.25 to 7%. So that just highlights the fact that this ongoing increase in interest rates and inflation is obviously the big issue. Following slide, we have spoken about this a lot in terms of the employment growth and the labour market. I think we dealt with that in quite a lot of detail in Pero. So on the following slide, what does this mean for the fiscal framework? So the National Treasury put out their MTBS, and we go into a bit of detail in the book from page 29 onwards in chapter 3, explaining how the impact of the national fiscal framework feeds through into the provincial fiscal framework. Obviously, what happens is that as National Treasury is trying to deliver a fiscal consolidation and reduce the consolidated budget deficit from 4.9% of GDP to 3.2% of GDP over the MTEF, the impact is that the allocations to provinces remain very, very low and are not growing at a rapid rate. And so you see there the medium-term allocation to provinces increase on average by 2.79% a year. Average inflation that the National Treasury expects over the time is 4.77%. So you'll see that allocations to the province are rising at a lower rate than inflation, and so there's a real decline of almost 2% to the province. It's likely that inflation may even be higher than that over the MTEF. As you know, the PES is the most important funding source, accounting for about 3/4 of the provincial envelope. And there have been two changes in PES. We go into a bit of detail in the book for members that are interested in understanding exactly what's happened, a breakdown of where the changes have arisen, and also particularly around the continued phasing in of the health risk adjusted component, which is one of the big areas, and we can take questions on that if there's time, and also some of our issues in terms of the measurement issues on that. But the long and the short of it is that there are two effects on the provincial equitable share, which we explain in the book in some detail, as I said. The first is an adjustment to the baselines due to the impact of new data updates in the PES formula. What that basically relates to is this change in the health formula to increase what they call a risk-adjusted measure. What they're basically doing is provinces that have higher risk, health risk, are getting more money, and provinces with less health risk are getting less money. Of course, we have less health risk, we have low fertility rates, low maternal death rates, etc., and so that leads to a reduction over time. The second thing relates to education data updates and how those have been incorporated, and then over and above that, there's been two additions to the allocations to provinces for health pressures and for education pressures, and that adds 4.5 billion to the allocations over the MTEF. We can take questions on this also, but we have also very recently, I think yesterday, been given an indication of how the National Treasury is going to deal with compensation pressures over the MTEF. That we will incorporate as part of the main budget when we get there. but we can discuss the particular strategy and how we've taken that into account. This is just giving a sort of a preliminary set of how we're thinking about particularly the main budget. So that gives you the fiscal framework overall, highlighting there that the Ecuador share rises from 57.8 billion in 23-24 to 62.3 billion in 25-26. As you can see there, not very strong growth. Conditional grants, no change to conditional grants at this stage. There may be changes as we go along. Annalise has highlighted the changes in the adjustments estimate. At this stage, we haven't revised up our own receipts line. There are indications that we're only halfway through the year. There are some indications that particularly gambling revenue and motor vehicle license fees and health fees are doing relatively well. That is not necessarily a good thing per se because it's partly related to inflation. So prices are rising, gambling. We haven't incorporated that yet in this forecast of over the 3 years of receipts, but we will obviously bring that with the main budget. But this just gives a sense of where we're looking at the moment. And then the bottom part of the table gives you an outline of the receipts, how it works out by percentages. We'll talk in a moment a little bit about the asset financing reserve and the role of PRA financing over the MTIF, which we're trying to phase out. On the right-hand side are the provincial reserves. So Annalise spoke about the fact that we have had to be very careful about potential increases for the wage agreement. So you'll know, obviously, the Minister of Finance has sort of imposed a 3% wage agreement on everyone. Some of us got increases yesterday or a week ago. That money has to be paid from the provincial treasury. So we do need money in the bank to pay it. We were uncertain exactly how much money we would be given by National. Fortunately, the letter yesterday gives us some indications, and so that will also be part of the cycle as we go forward on main budget day. We have, however, as Annalise said, particularly in budget day, we put down a lot in reserves because we want to be very, very careful about this amount. You can understand that a 3% wage increase or a 6% wage increase or even a 7.5% wage increase all has to come from the Treasury. We have to find the cash for that. We have to be very sure that we have the money available and that it will be paid out. So we've been very, very conservative in terms of thinking about that over the MTIF. So that's just giving you a sense of how we think about the next 3 years. Then this just gives an outline of the preliminary allocations for conditional grants. Just highlighting that they all are rising by roughly inflation over the MTIF, but some of them are not. There have been some changes. There are some indications of changes to conditional grants, which we'll also deal with when we get there. So on the following slide, what we've done here is we don't publish line-by-line vote information in terms of spending because there is still a lot that has to happen in terms of our own processes, in terms of converting the preliminary allocations to final allocations for budget day. What we do provide is a summary of 3-year spending projections by policy area. So we aggregate according to different areas, and that's just trying to show where we're thinking about in terms of spending rising over the MTIF. And as you can see, the fastest growing areas are in housing, health, and particularly environmental protection, although off a very low base. It kind of gives you a very high-level view of the preliminary allocations and how they'll be panning out. I'm now going to ask Ms. Taryn van der Rede to talk a little bit about the budgetary policy principles that have informed this process.
Thank you, Dr. Haverman. So just in terms of the overall Western Cape fiscal strategy, it really responds to our economic and fiscal environment and also our service delivery pressures. In support of our Western Cape fiscal strategy, we also have our budget policy principles, which includes protecting basic services outcomes, unlocking allocated efficiency, enhancing productive efficiency, and also enabling long-run fiscal sustainability. So this slide just provides you with an overview of how we're practically giving effect to these principles. In terms of protecting basic services outcomes, it's really about how we protect health, education, and social development, but also how we protect the mandated services in other departments. And then with regards to unlocking allocative efficiency, it's about how we give effect to our priorities of growth for jobs, safety, well-being, and our enablers of innovation, culture, and governance. As part of this process, we have also had to make a number of trade-offs within these areas and really identifying those interventions that yield the greatest impact. Then with regards to enhancing productive efficiency, it's really looking at the overall composition of our budget in terms of COE, how we apply compensation ceilings, and then also how we look strategically at our transfers, in particular transfers to municipalities as well as public entities. And then with regards to long-run fiscal sustainability, our focus is really on rebuilding our reserves. So it needs to be noted that our successful response to COVID-19 was as a result of our reserves, and so we really need to rebuild these reserves in order to protect us from future shocks. Next slide. So then in terms of the fiscal strategy, we also have a number of transversal instruments that's really driving service delivery. This includes our compensation of employees strategy. So here, the compensation of employees strategy is not just about managing headcount or applying the restrictions in terms of the budgets, but it's also about how we better align our compensation planning to the delivery plans of departments. Secondly, in terms of infrastructure investment and development, we also, as a Provincial Treasury, put together a project preparation facility, and this is really to support departments in terms of the project preparation phase of infrastructure planning. Then we also put together a fiscal transition support facility, and it's really about supporting those departments in terms of the upfront costs that will yield long-run savings. And this is really in terms of supporting our innovative projects. And then lastly is expenditure reviews. And here the Provincial Treasury partnered with GTAC. And over the past 2 years, we've done a number of expenditure reviews that really looks at identifying areas of efficiency as well as greater impact. And the intention is going forward that we actually start inculcating this methodology within the Provincial Treasury. Next slide. So then this slide just provides you with an overview of the budgetary and service delivery risks, which have been identified as part of our policy planning and budgeting process, including our PGM tech engagements with the departments. It should also be noted that all these risks cannot be accommodated through a budgetary response, but we're also encouraging departments to look at non-fiscal measures in order to address or manage these risks. So they also cut across growth for jobs, safety, well-being, innovation, culture, and governance. And I'm not going to go to the detail of all of them. But in terms of growth for jobs, one of our key risks is around energy security, which is quite evident to everyone in terms of the extent of load shedding right now. Youth unemployment and disillusionment. So 2/3 of the unemployed are youth, and therefore a key risk for the province. Our current public transport crisis, which also emphasizes the need for our mobility department, and then also the backlog in maintenance and new infrastructure, also emphasizing the importance of the need for an overall infrastructure plan and strategy for this province, which is currently under development. Then with regards to safety, it's the extent of violence and crime, which is quite evident in terms of the data that was released yesterday. Violence at schools affecting learner performance and teacher morale. With regards to well-being, the focus here is on increasing household hunger in communities, and as was previously presented, this also speaks to our allocation to food relief. Undesirable learner-teacher ratios, which is currently at average of 31 learners per teacher, and then also increasing demand for mental health services and psychosocial support, which is also evident in particular after COVID-19. Then lastly, with regards to innovation, culture, and governance, some of the key risks here is the financial sustainability as a result of our economic and fiscal environment, managing cybersecurity services, which has become an increasing challenge for the Department of the Premier, and then also sustaining broadband services across the province, which largely affects schools and hospitals. Next slide. Then this slide just provides you with an overview of our proposed budget policy priorities over the MTEF, given our prelim budget of 238.5 billion. With regards to growth for jobs, it includes ease of doing business, and here we're really focusing on some of the systemic red tape issues. Investment is really how we further attract investment into the Western Cape and also enabling export growth. Infrastructure is around managing, maintaining, and expanding public infrastructure. work opportunities and skills. And here we're also placing a specific emphasis on how we link to the education system. Economic resilience cuts across the areas of energy, water, and waste. Safety is a large emphasis on LEAP, as well as increasing road safety. Violence prevention has quite a number of policy priority areas, but one of our game changers is also the violence prevention unit that we're establishing in the Department of Health. Urban design is improving living spaces of the Western Cape citizens. And then our safety enabler is really about how we take a more data-driven approach to the Western Cape safety plan, building on the HECTIS model in the Department of Health, as well as supporting the area-based teams. Then with regards to well-being, we have increased well-being, and a key priorities here is the health recovery and resurgence strategy post-COVID-19, the issues around mental health and well-being, building social cohesion really, as well as the meeting basic needs, really touches on our key priority areas within social development, which is strengthening the NPO sector, child and youth care centres, as well as food relief, and then also importantly is shelter spaces for the homeless. Then Strong Foundations focuses on our Department of Health as well as education, health in terms of the first 1,000 days, and then education in terms of quality ECD facilities and improving learning outcomes. And then lastly is our enabler, innovation, culture and governance, and this supports growth for jobs, safety and well-being, cuts across the departments of Provincial Treasury, Department of the Premier, as well as local government. And here we're looking at areas of digital transformation, integrated service delivery, linking to our JDMA, governance transformation, citizen-centered culture and innovation. I'm not going to go through the detail within each of those. And then lastly from my side is our new chapter for the MTBPS, which is governing for growth. And here we're looking at how we methodically increase governance maturity over time. Oh, next slide, sorry. As well as looking at how we leverage our governance systems to enable growth within the province. So one of our key levers in this area is supply chain and the implementation of our supply chain management strategy. And this strategy focuses on SCM governance, capacitation and development, technology and strategic procurement. So overall in this chapter, we're really emphasizing what those governance systems are within the Provincial Treasury, Department of the Premier and local government that we can really leverage in order to enable growth within the province. So it includes areas like optimizing assurance and oversight in the Department of the Premier as well as combined assurance. And then the next slide, I'll just hand over to my HOD for concluding remarks. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, team. Yes, I mean there's a lot that I think members will note is on new innovations that we've introduced within the MTBPS documentation as well, and the one that Ms. van der Rede just paused on is indeed this new chapter on governing for growth, which is really trying to rise to the challenge of saying it's not just about compliance. It's about how does compliance convert into effective service delivery right across the province, and how do we make sure that our systems are performance oriented and performance driven to make the most impact possible for citizens. So we're very happy to be able to include that chapter for this year, and I think it underpins what the seriousness with which the province is treating both the dynamics in our supply chain management environments and the regulatory issues there, as well as some of the recommendations of the Zondo Commission, as the Minister had mentioned herself in her speech. I think just in conclusion, there are a number of pretty significant challenges and risks that are lying ahead of us in the province, and the MTBPS tries to set the course, if I may use the metaphors that the Minister used, and it doesn't attempt to resolve every issue in our fiscal positioning for the 2023 MTEF. It rather is it's a milestone on that journey to resolving the issues, and when we come back to the committee in March, Yes, it will be March. With the final budget for the 23 MTEF, we would have made significant progress on outstanding issues. We'd hopefully have a lot more certainty around some of the challenges and risks that we have. But I think it is clear that some tough choices have already been made in this MTBPS in making sure that the province is on that path from recovery to growth, and we will continue to do that as we go through the budget process, the remainder of the budget process, and that's, as the Minister outlined here, our MTBPS is to provide that framework for hope, promoting a budget that cares, that prepares us for the journey ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know there was a lot of information. I must admit, trying to implement the recommendations of the Zondo Commission in itself is a very ambitious goal. I mean, the last chapter, which I think was chapter 4, that dealt with corruption in the first edition in the beginning of 2022 that was published, just dealt with how to establish a public procurement independent authority that deals with court systems, that deals with prosecuting, that deals with general public procurement. What if the Central Public Procurement Authority was not there? So the one chapter in and of itself was quite a chunk of information. And when you take all of those various different editions into account and the new supply chain management instructions and regulations that are not regulations that you're going to have to try and craft your own journey for as the provincial government, I cannot just imagine the amount of work that is before you. But colleagues, I am going to take 6 hands. And of those 6 hands, everyone is going to get an opportunity for 2 questions each, so that 6 people, 6 unique people, can have an opportunity to ask questions, so that we don't end up with 12 questions per person, so that everyone gets an opportunity. I did see a hand in the chamber from Member Fry. I see a hand up on Member Ms. Kamish Ahmad's laptop from Member Mackenzie. I see a hand from Member Murray in the chamber. Those are the only 3 hands I see so far. So those were the first 3 hands, and then I will take another 3 hands. 2 questions each member. If I feel that you're asking more than 2 questions, I'm going to put my mic back on. Cool. If we have extra time left afterwards, we will deal with more questions. Thank you so much. In that order.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, now I have to tread water now, because I had 12 questions, but now I only have 2. I'm going to focus on the Meadow presentation, and thank you, ma'am. I was going to ask to stop you and just breathe, because it was so fast. And I understand that we are time pressured, but yeah. The 2 questions is on slide 6. I just want to check the contraction of the economy, the transport and storage and communication. My question would be also regarding slide 6 and slide 12, when you look at exports. I come from an international trade and development management background, so exports and imports is my thing. I would like to know, how would the government, and maybe this is the wrong forum, but how do we govern for growth when our ports and our transport system is backtracking, it's receding, it's contracting, and that's my major worry. I think that for me is one of the core principles or core elements that might just break this whole system. Because exports is one of the lifebloods of our economy. And how do we see, what is the outlook for that? Because I don't see a good outlook for transport anytime soon, at least not for my peers in the industry. And this is my second question, promise. Last question, promise. Population, slide 20, population size and economic opportunities. If our population is growing, sorry, I'm just trying to get to that slide. if our population is growing at the rates that we say, and our economic opportunities are becoming less, and our economy is growing not at the required rate, surely that Gini coefficient is under severe pressure, and it's going to become even more difficult to find a job in this province. What do we do? That's 2 questions.
Thank you so much. I'm not sure if Member Fry's second question requires the Minister to repeat her speech, but we're going to go to Member Mackenzie.
Thank you, Chairperson. I think there are 2 questions. Does it apply to online members as well?
Yes, Mackenzie, and if you don't speak quickly, I might reduce them.
Okay. Okay, on slide number 19 of the first presentation, I really actually enjoy the slide. If you look at the different industries, and particularly given that we've just recently come from an oversight visit on the West Coast, the fishing industry historically has been a great industry for many of our smaller communities, and we see a lot more people moving to smaller towns as they came through a threat, and what we've seen in our physical infrastructure, our physical site visits. So have we looked at how mining versus fishing/agriculture affect those small towns, and how we allocate funding or assist municipalities in those smaller towns? In Matsikama, for example, there are 68 mining applications in. So if you were to allocate resources 10 years ago or 5 years ago, you'd have looked at the mining sector or the mining towns. Now the industries are changing in Matsikama when of the 3 big mining companies are mining. I think that's, like I said, there's 68 mining companies in, so that's going to change. The whole economic outlook of that town is going to change for the next 5 to 10 years. So are you really looking at how we're assisting municipalities catering for the new economies going forward? The second question is, on our allocation of funding to the rural municipalities, have we really looked at, or are we going forward, really look at the monitoring and tools for those municipalities? Example, our coastal towns, and we've seen it many years ago when physical inspections was done, and we saw another allocation of money for new schools and physical site inspections by ourselves as oversight committees. Have you looked at drones as a monitoring tool? Because we saw Department of Agriculture and Elsenburg is using it extensively. And how do you fund such tools in the smaller municipalities to say, as opposed to 5 people going to visit, and I'm using Matsikama because we were physically there, we with the Treasury looked at sending out drones to look at providing oversight at how they spent funding? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Member Murray.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, my first question is from the budget presentation, page 21. It was mentioned that there was an 800,000 Rand approximately COE saving. I just wanted to understand if this COE saving was as a result of vacant posts, and if so, would there be any measure taken to fill those posts? I understand the posts were frozen and resulted in vacant posts. Then if not, if you could just give me clarity on that. Thanks. Then my second question is page 31, summary of 3-year spending by policy area. I wanted to just get an idea of how the allocation was decided, or the policy area was decided. So, for example, it's quite welcome to see the increase for environmental protection, but I do think it's concerning to see that there's a minus 5.8% towards public order and safety. If we can just get some clarity on that as well. Thank you.
I saw the 4th hand being Member Nkondlo. I don't see any other hands, so I will then go after Member Nkondlo. Thank you.
No, thank you, Chair. Yeah, it's very tough after so many presentations that we must ask only 2 questions. So I think the issue of timing is something that we must consider between ourselves as this committee and Provincial Treasury to really give a more reasonable engagement on such very important information. On the Mero, I would...
Your question. On a Thursday, as per Programming Authority, the
Can I
budget
finish first?
technically sits until it decides it is not sitting anymore. The 5 o'clock on your calendar is because when you send a calendar invite out, you have to indicate an end time in the meeting invite. The reason I'm asking for 2 questions per member is because sometimes members ask 12 or 13 or 20 questions each, and then we don't necessarily get to everyone in the committee to ask the questions that they want to ask. So I've opened up for 6 people at first for 2 questions each, and depending on how we go, we can always open up for another round of questions. But you're not being stopped from asking questions. And because it's also, MTBPS is also an overview, there will also be extra opportunities in the various committees to also ask questions should you wish. I hope this assists.
With your privilege to chair, Honourable Chairperson of the Budget Committee, I would have been happy if you had allowed me to continue, because you would always have the indulgence to respond to all our questions. And I was here in the meeting when we were explaining this process. On the Mero, I would like to appreciate, I think the new data areas that has been included, and just want to check with Treasury that the process to add such new data, how do you sort of come up with those areas from which you would add such data? What kind of measure do you use, and to get to those priorities that or areas that you would add? That's my first question. And then my second one on the provincial treasury, I'm interested to know on the slide on the priorities, one on the jobs and also on the safety, that how do you deal and respond to the current infrastructure problems, particularly experienced by those operating in the informal sector, townships and small rural towns in particular, where there wouldn't be sufficient or reasonable capital infrastructure to enable them to trade, nor broadband infrastructure to help them improve in the kind of e-commerce or trading space using technology. So how are these factored in as part of the jobs and the safety element in those spaces? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Minister officials, I'm going to allow for those first before I open up again. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to respond to the port question and then I'll hand over for the remainder. Honourable Fry, you're absolutely right. The port is absolutely essential for the functioning of the economy, and we have seen inefficiencies in the port, but with my other hat on, we've been doing a lot of work to try and improve efficiency, not only at the port, but across the logistics chain. We in fact have a project manager that we have specifically seconded for the purpose of helping to improve efficiencies with the port, who is a port expert who deals with the container terminal in the main, and we've conducted several pieces of research to try and help improve efficiencies of the port, and we have seen improvements at the port. So, for example, ships arriving to berth is now approximately 1 day or less. So pretty much ships arriving can berth almost immediately. Some rubber tie gantries have been refurbished, and another one has been brought to Cape Town from Port Elizabeth. And there's several other efficiencies that have been seen over the last couple of months, but I think it might be an idea to present to one of the standing committees on what's happening in the port space. And of course, through our advocacy work, we are lobbying the national government very hard for private sector participation at the Port of Cape Town.
I think on the ports question, I mean, the Minister in her speech raised the points of another port of entry, which is the Cape Town Airport, International Airport. And it's kind of useful, I think, to think of where we've got to there in a partnership model. It's not our asset as a province. It's a national asset, but we've partnered with AXA and achieved remarkable success. So it's not necessary that you have to own the asset to be part of its success. And clearly, there's a long way to go in our port environment, but that process is very much underway, although it faces significant challenges. I'll ask my colleagues to assist with some of the questions and possibly to more intelligently than I do to start with, but I'll give some of them a go. I think, Honourable Fryer, you asked the question in terms of population growth and sluggish economic growth and rising inequality. I think what we can also get in those situations is rising absolute levels of poverty. And that's something that we would be concerned about. I mean, interestingly enough, you would get in periods of high growth, you can also get rising levels of inequality, but diminishing levels of absolute poverty, and so that they are two quite different dynamics. I think the challenge that we face, and that sort of starts to come out in the district reviews, is that we're not necessarily leveraging the power of in-migration and urbanization to lift the maximum number of people out of absolute poverty. And so we're tending to see an urbanization of poverty, which is a very dissimilar trend to what you see elsewhere in the world, and we've spoken about that in the committee before. Honourable Mackenzie, the question of small towns and particularly resource-reliant towns, I think my colleagues can definitely speak to quite a sophisticated engagement that we have. The Mero is one element of that engagement, and from here, it's really the starting point in each annual cycle of an engagement, is saying, how do you respond to local economic conditions? And we can talk through and local changes in local economic conditions. And we do that in an integrated way. We engage with our municipalities in an integrated way across a number of departments, and we try and make sure that there's a transition through into the budget process as well. So, alongside this, the tabling of the Mero, and Ms. Pick was holding it up earlier in terms of how the province responds. We also produce annually, and in the adjustments budget, an adjustment to our annual publication of provincial and municipal infrastructure investment, which is part of the resource allocation that's going down to a district and a local level as well. So the budget very much tries to respond both procedurally and quantitatively in terms of the allocation of resources to trends that we can see in local economies across the province, and as Dr. Haverman was saying, in an increasingly differentiated way. So it is, I suppose that's one of the benefits of being able to table the Mero as well as the adjustment estimates in MTBPS, as you can see all of the instruments at play simultaneously. Because that's very much how we see it as the provincial treasury, using data, evidence to really adjust course and try and keep our eye on the horizon and making sure that we're responding to conditions on the ground in individual municipal areas. I won't repeat the points that others have made, but the Central Karoo, for example, is a very interesting case for me when you read across the data sets and the minister mentioned this in her speech as well, rising teenage pregnancies in that area, quite high levels of school dropout as well. And if we can start to correlate that data, we can start to understand what is the specific response that is needed from a social development, from an education, and from a health perspective in the Central Karoo. And are those young women vulnerable? How do we make sure that they are protected and cared for? We don't, of course, in the Mero attempt to give the answers, I think the detail of the policy questions in terms of how you make an intervention in that particular issue is something that specialists in the Department of Health and Social Development and in education are much better placed to handle than us. But we can see the data, and we think that there's an important questions to be asked there, and that's why we obviously encourage the committee and all the standing committees to be asking those questions. Honourable Mackenzie, do we use drones? Not as the Provincial Treasury. I think some of my colleagues might want us to at certain points, but yes, certainly the Department of Agriculture does, and it's ramped up. I think a very successful drone program. I think that I think even the Department of Local Government in terms of its disaster management functions. So there's a wave of new technology that's becoming available. We're not using that for expenditure surveillance at this point. I mean, we do use digital tools, but not specifically drones at this point. But the province is increasingly adopting that, and we are starting to build the capacity of our personnel. In fact, Department of Agriculture, as you may know, sends officials to become licensed drone pilots and are working for the provincial government. And they were key to our, for example, the locust response a little bit earlier in this financial year. I'll ask Ms. Pick to address the questions of the savings on compensation and the vacant posts issue. I know Dr. Hardeman will want to give the answer on the relative decline by cluster, by functional area. So I won't steal his thunder there, other than it is, of course, off a very low base. Honourable Nkondlo, in terms of the process for adding new data in the Mero, I think first and foremost we try and listen to our readers, including this committee. And so you asked a number of I think excellent questions last year, and we immediately kind of looked as to what extent can we find the data that can respond to that. Now, obviously the committee here, this committee is not our only reader. We engage obviously with our district municipalities, with our local municipalities, and they're all asking questions. As I said in previous years, it's quite hard to mainstream new data into the publication just by clicking one's fingers. We need to evaluate the integrity and credibility of the data set, and we need to evaluate the extent to which it will provide a reliable data stream going forward. Otherwise, we sort of a one-hit wonder on a particular issue. So we look at it very carefully. We're wanting to make sure that it's credible, it's repeatable, and that it's, most importantly, it's relevant to you, the reader. So we had a discussion in this committee on the question of inequality last year and measurements of inequality, and the team worked really hard on trying to figure out how could we give really grow that base. And you'll see there's a discussion on how to understand different measures of inequality, how to understand the nature of inequality, and where it might emerge in incomes, expenditures, and assets, and then we're starting to fill in the data sets around that as well. So the housing market studies, for instance, are really a part of that response. We do have other data sets in sight, but they're not mature enough yet. And so, there were two that were mentioned, I think, by Nadia. The one is in terms of taxpayers and some of the tax data that we can get in an anonymized form now from the South African Revenue Service. So we're opening that data avenue, and it's got a number of data streams in it. And I think over the next while, we'll start to get, as we get more comfortable with what those are, what's possible there, we're going to start to be introducing that. That's very novel data at a subnational level in the South African context. The other is some deeds registry data on land title, and there's a project underway with the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform. I understand it's not quite mature enough for publication yet, but we're hoping that next year we would start to be able to mainstream some of that data into the Mero. And then I do recognize the question of infrastructure challenges that informal traders might have, particularly in small towns. I think that is something that is often best addressed by the municipalities themselves, and we do engage them on that in terms of their infrastructure responses. They do have funding that is available for that purpose through the Municipal Infrastructure Grant. The province also does have programs that support in that respect, and the Department of Economic Development and Tourism is one such place where those responses are there. I think when the minister comes to speak to the House at some point in the near future around the Growth for Jobs strategy, I think it's also been something that's been discussed in that context as well. But let me hand over to first Dr. Haverman, then Nadia Ringquest, and then Annalise to add anything on those matters.
Thank you very much, HD. The one publication we didn't talk about, which is this additional thing called the Additional and Amended Allocations to Municipalities, which I think answers members Mackenzie's question around how we allocate and other things. And it's actually a very useful thing if members have got the time to go through it, because it talks about how the province allocates direct resources to municipalities. Obviously, we provide a lot of support to municipalities in a variety of different ways, in person, but money is often more important for municipalities, and they certainly think that. And you'll see there things like maintenance and construction of transport infrastructure, some other areas around informal settlements, upgrading partnership grant, which is a pass-through grant, etc., etc. It's very, very interesting to see how much of the budget and the resources go directly to municipalities. So we didn't talk about it, but since you gave us an opportunity to talk about it, and we took the gap and grabbed it, so it is something to think about. And I'll just quickly deal with the policy area question. Yes, as the HG says, it's very low base. It's quite impacted by the third year. Generally, it actually rises from 720 to 728, but because of some engagements we're having in the third year, it just comes out as being quite a lot lower. But it also helps understand, because there are so many votes, I think it's quite useful to do it by area. So that's kind of how we present it over the MTIF. But as HT said, it is quite a low base. I'm going to hand over to Ms. Ringquist just to go through the questions on the Mero, which I think were very, very interesting.
Thanks so much, Dr. Haverman. I think our HOT addressed most of the questions that was asked. However, I just want to comment on Member Nkondo's question in regard to informal sector support. And the Mero does address or provide considerations for local government. As he mentioned, this is most likely to be addressed within the local government space. As we know, local government is an autonomous part of government, and so the Mero is there to provide the information, to provide the research, to provide the data, as many municipalities don't have the capacity to collect all this data and write publications themselves. And so while we do provide all the data, we do, like I mentioned earlier, give recommendations or make proposals that local government can consider. And on page 42 in section A of the Mero, we speak to the informal sector. What I didn't mention earlier as I was rushing through my presentation was that the informal sector actually suffered very badly during the pandemic and has struggled to recover, because in times of recession or contraction of the economy, the informal sector is usually the sector that picks up the slack. People become entrepreneurs, they'll start their own businesses, as they get retrenched or lose their formal jobs. However, this has not been the case in the Western Cape during the pandemic and after, and even still the informal sector has struggled to recover. So this is a very unique phenomenon during a contraction, because we expect the informal sector to pick up the slack. So we give recommendations in terms of what local government needs to have in place in order to have a thriving and a well-functioning informal sector, as that they are a very important part of the economy and they do contribute to jobs and economic recovery in times of a contraction or recession. Thank you.
I'm going to do the COE question in terms of the question on the underspending, the projected underspending in the second quarter. So for our COE budget, we have a 41 billion rand COE budget, and the strategy of the province is really about a bespoke COE strategy per department. So each of the departments have their own strategy in terms of that responds to the service delivery model, the pressures that they assuming that they are going to face. That then gets put into a recruitment plan. And so what departments are showing now is in terms of the difference in terms of the actual filling of that recruitment plan, and that becomes the difference. So why would there be then the difference between what they've planned for recruitment and then what actually is happening? So as much as at certain departments, as part of the strategy is the fact of the matter is we as a treasury, we put ceilings in place for each of the departments in which they need to operate and in terms of that strategy that they have decided for themselves. Now, what they cannot predict is in terms of resignations, applications for early retirement of staff. They cannot also predict in terms of those posts that they are indicating that is vacant and funded as part of the recruitment plan, how internal promotions would then happen. So you can understand that if there's an internal promotions, it means other posts then become vacant. And then there's also a lag time in terms of then filling those new posts that become vacant. Now, all that impacts then in terms of savings on the recruitment plan that they have, that they cannot predict. So from that perspective, then they start projecting in terms of that impact then of reality on their recruitment plan becomes this projected underspending. So it's not as if departments are freezing posts that you now see the underspending. It's really about this some of the reality on the ground that they cannot predict to a certain degree within their plans. So that's the one aspect. Then in terms of also within the Department of Health, in their recruitment plan, as I indicated, they received funding also for COVID. So they made some assumptions around the COE requirements based on the COVID funding that they received. So as the department has indicated in terms of the rollout then of the COVID is not as they predicted, therefore that would also impact that recruitment plan that they put in. So there would then start being some posts that they will not fill because they don't need to fill those posts in terms of rollout where COVID is concerned. So it's that combination then in terms of why we would be showing then this projected underspending as a province as at the 30th of June. So also then, if anything in terms of the recruitment plan, so each of the departments also make some assumptions on when there are going to be, when there's vacancies, they then decide that they might not fill all the posts that become vacant. So then there's decision making, and we also have encouraged departments to have COE committees within their as part of the COE strategy to re-evaluate every post that becomes vacant through resignations, through early retirement, through internal promotions, of whether that post must be filled or is there a higher priority on other posts that need to be filled. Now that sometimes that decision making also then in terms of is a lag time for them to complete, to fill then the vacant post or another post, which then in terms of takes longer than the assumptions they made. So some of the votes will make an assumption that it takes, and I think in the Treasury, we have an assumption that it will take us 4 to 6 months to fill a post. So if it takes, and then we actually will budget for that post. Now, if it takes us longer than 6 months, a saving already then comes about. And that's then in terms of, so it's a combination of all these factors then that leads us in terms of the underspending that is projected by departments in total. So I also need to put it in context. So our 41 billion rand budget, we were showing 248 as a province in terms of the underspending, but it's those combinations of why.
I was just about to open the second round of questions because we didn't have 6 people in the original round, which I did promise people. So you can take number 5. Colleagues, I just also want to remind us, because we have so much documents in front of us, we will also have lots of reading time in order to unpack them in the various committees. Member Murray, I just want to see if there's any other hands online. Okay, from my side, I'm going to have some fascinating reading time trying to understand why there's a 15% of exports from the Central Karoo regarding crustaceans. Member Murray.
Thank you, Chair. Just to my question, so that 800,000, it's something that you see quite often, or is it specific to the year under review? How would it be different, the under expenditure that you were talking about? And then I had another question. I'm not sure if it was answered or if I might have missed it. It was with regards to the policy prioritization for expenditure, page 31, I think it was. Thanks.
So at this stage, in terms of...
I see another hand online. Who's that? Member Nkondlo, you may go ahead.
Thank you. A follow-up, Chair. And thank you for the response. I just wanted to understand this question. Whilst I acknowledge that local government is its own sphere, and the discussions around them having grants and everything else, because my understanding, unless I'm missing it, because the understanding of all the effort made with this municipal economic review outlook is in line with the government's intention of using evidence-based planning. Now, for me, at what point, and I heard earlier on when the presenter started, they indicated that they will be actually going into some kind of engagement or roadshow with districts on this, because the intention is for them to utilize this for planning. So once again, I think it's a question that I've asked before and I'm repeating it, that what is the level of relationship between this tool that we go to lengths to improve year in and year out and the planning of the municipalities, so that we, as we are told here, that this is supposedly to enable them, we are able to see what is in the marrow being responded to by the municipalities. What are the kind of conversations that you are having with them? Or this is just a nice document that is presented to them, then they can make a decision to actually utilize it to influence their planning, and I mean, it gathers dust there. So I think that is just my concern, to the extent to which we are making a spend deliberate, and it's a proper one on scientific data. But how do we ensure that this data lands, and what measure can we then be able to follow that over these marrows that we have actually developed, we are actually seeing the improvement of planning of the municipalities in line with the evidence that we are producing through this document. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll just end up then with my question. I want to know, you indicated that you're starting to use anonymized forms of data from SARS. In the beginning of this year, we had the budget workshop where we actually invited SARS, and it was apparently the second ever type of engagement with SARS by like a provincial legislature. So they were so excited to engage with us on revenue. And something we picked up was SARS actually has such sophisticated electronic IT systems, and they share, for example, the information with SIPs and DTIC and all of those type of entities in terms of business registration and so on. Is it not possible, in order to create a more reliable set of data, or more accurate or more useful set of data, to ask SARS how we can use some of the information in, for example, an anonymized manner so that they don't need to breach any information times of, I don't know what the proper wording is, in comparison to us being able to use the extra information. And then because you mentioned the Central Karoo and what does one do in terms of jobs, and I'm a constituency head in the Central Karoo. I'm in Beaufort West. So I just want to say thank you to the Minister, because a week and a half ago, in the middle of the night, during stage 4, stage 3 load shedding, I messaged her for help with 2 young youth females in terms of youth applications for tertiary. And I was like, I don't know, these kids want to go study boat and shipbuilding. They're from the Karoo. I don't know where to go. And she responded so quickly, and we were able to, amidst that stage 3, stage 4 load shedding in the middle of the night, help them apply. So I do think when we think about how do we get some of this information, it's sometimes one can use this high level information, just ask the people, what exactly are the presentations out of this information you would like us to focus on in that area? Who are the youth? What do you want to know from the Mero? What do you want to know from the Pero? I'm on like 10 different WhatsApp groups, and what I do is, if the one tells me I'm a farmer, I want to know what's going on in agriculture, I'm always the first person to ask, send me 10 extra agriculture annual reports so that I can take it to the person in case I need to ask a follow-up. If it's a youth, sometimes they ask me, what is the Department of the Premier, or what is this Department of Economic Affairs doing in terms of businesses or starting a business? And you take the documents that you get online. So when you go on those different type of roadshows, perhaps try and ask those stakeholders, what exactly is it that you would like us also to focus on? Because the same way that different districts will have different exports and different imports and different industries that they focus on, different districts will also have those different economic levers, for lack of a better word, that those stakeholders would like you to focus on. And I think when you then start breaking those down, people would really appreciate the type of information to be able to empower them. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll let Annelies come back on the question of the compensation. I mean, other than to say, of course, we have a very large workforce in the province, and a significant portion of our spending is on compensation. So the numbers may look large, but in the overall spending on compensation in the province, they're not particularly large, and particularly in relation to the risks that may present themselves, which is obviously where we keep a BDI. But Annelies can talk to the kind of comparative perspective in that respect. On your question on the policy priorities, so that is slide 31. Essentially, that organizes it by functional grouping that national government uses, so it's a useful way to get an insight into it. There are two dynamics there that you've got to kind of understand to read the data on the trajectory. The one is that, as Dr. Haverman was saying, is there may be in a particular year, in a very small functional grouping, okay, there may be a very particular issue that is being dealt with. So in case of public safety, I can tell you exactly what that issue is, and I think that's what he was trying to explain. In year 3, in relation to the LEAP program, there's been money allocated, but there's a discussion in terms of the cost-sharing arrangement with the City of Cape Town. Now, in the bigger scheme of things, it's a relatively minor issue, but because of the relatively low baseline here, it reflects as a decline. Okay, that's not per se a policy choice. The second thing, in fact, I can say it's definitely not a policy choice. Are we going to withdraw funding from public order and safety? It's just that there is a cost-sharing arrangement with the City of Cape Town associated with that with that program, and there's a very low base here. The second issue is, of course, where the province already allocates the bulk of its funding. You may have you're not seeing the period prior to this projection. So you look at the education, you may say there's limited growth in education, but you will remember we put significant additional resources towards education, the 1,100 new teachers, the big infrastructure spend, the rapid school build program. That's underway now. That's already tucked into the baseline. There's not an immediate additional spending requirement because that's already been met. And so then when you look at your average growth, it's going to look relatively low as a result as well, because you're not seeing that figure, particularly in the bigger functional areas. And then a third dynamic, of course, well, in the big functional areas, is that you may make a significant additional contribution, but it's such a huge part of provincial spending that it doesn't look particularly big in percentage terms. So, if you add a lot to a small baseline or reduce a lot from a small baseline, suddenly the numbers go through the roof. But when in the case of one of our really large functional areas, those effects are significantly more muted. Honourable Nkonlo, on the question of the evidence-based planning, I think, let me first say that I think you ask a really important question, is how do we ensure that we have impact in terms of improved planning and budgeting? And that really is a frontier for us. We are asking ourselves that question. Is there a way we can directly measure the quality of this publication and the quality of a municipal budget? Now, obviously, it's not a straight line. There's just not an automatic connection there. There's people. And there are different spheres of government and so forth. But I think it is a worthwhile issue for us to consider a little bit more, is can we see over time improvements in the quality of planning as a result, not just of the publications and the quality of the publications, but also the quality of our engagements. Now, we put equal emphasis on both of them. This is where, as I said earlier, the process starts. We now have the basis of facts to go out and engage with municipalities. And so the first round of engagements, as the Minister mentioned in her speech, is with the district coordinating forums. The Minister also mentioned that she's convening a provincial budget and governance council where this will also be discussed. And so that's then at the high level with the leadership of municipalities at district and local level across the province. We also have, still in this calendar year, and part of very much in our sights now, following the tabling, is a meeting with all of the CFOs of municipalities across the province. And we don't talk to them just about accounting standards. We talk to them about development challenges, because that's a role of a CFO to understand that. And so in the short term, we've got these engagements that are coming up. Into the new year, we then have 2 standard annual engagements, which is a technical engagement on budget implementation with municipalities, and that's currently being designed, where we look at progress in their financial years, spending to date in their financial years, and that's followed by a strategic integrated municipal engagement with individual municipalities, where we talk about their planning for the next year. So what we're trying to do is not only in terms of our overall dissemination of this information as a first phase, but a second phase of following that up in the new year is to say, well, how is this affecting your in-year course corrections, which is what our technical engagements focus on. It's about preparation for their adjustments budget, remembering that they adjust their budgets a quarter later than we do, because they have a different financial year to us. And then how do they plan for the way ahead, our strategic budget-related engagements. And we're wanting to make sure that not only do they know what's in the book, but they've had an opportunity to interpret it, so that during those engagements we can talk to them and say, well, we take our Central Karoo issue with rising teen pregnancies. How are you responding? How do we as a province need to respond? Is this a question of money? Or is it a question of how we're arranging and organizing our services? Are we, to respond to a particular development challenge that we may be having? The key place we're wanting to see this there are two documents if we were to get into the measurement side, where we're wanting to see this at a municipal level take root. The first is in their integrated development plans, and the second is in their budget documentations for each financial year. Now, in some cases, we know that municipalities can literally cut and paste from this. That's not something we necessarily encourage. I think it's more nuanced than that is what we're looking for. It's a strategic dialogue to make sure we are collectively focusing on the right issues in terms of our respective roles and responsibilities. So, but Member Nkondlo, I think you ask, again, an excellent question. Are we being smart enough on measuring our impact year on year on year? Because that's why the team puts it together. It's not just as a sort of desktop exercise. It's a desire to have that impact, and I think we do need to get better and better at measuring it as the final part of that chain: production, dissemination, and engagement, but then measuring the impact as we go forward. The chairperson, you asked the question on SARS data. In fact, there is a secure data warehouse at National Treasury already, and it's that we're looking to access. So I think in the past it had been an issue, how easy it is it to get anonymized data and so forth. SARS is very happy to collaborate around that now, and National Treasury has set up a secure data warehouse that allows that anonymization to take place in a responsible way. And is going to turn on I think, a significant flow of really useful economic intelligence. There are challenges in the SARS data. It's not just the silver bullet to everything. And some of the data, they're headquarters problems where firms may report all of their data for Cape Town, even though they operate right across the whole province. And so one can get easily misled, and that's the verification data credibility issues that I was talking about earlier. And it's also why we need to make sure we're really understanding what's going on in the data, which I think brings me to your point on the crustaceans that you're going to be investigating in the Central Karoo, which we understand to be a headquarters problem. That's showing that up off a very low base of the economy. But Chair, as you then mentioned shipbuilding, the bursaries for shipbuilding as well, I'm starting to think maybe we need to reconsider that, because crustaceans, shipbuilding, maybe there's something that we're not yet understanding that's going on in the Central Karoo area, and that's the fascinating thing about looking at economic data. Is it artifacts that are telling you something that's wrong in reality, or is it actually shining a light on something that you've just missed? That process of discovery is both one of looking at the data and its own credibility, but also talking to people and our engagements with municipalities, our engagements with the business community, and so forth in each of these local areas. And so we really think that this is becoming quite a useful publication to have those conversations going forward. The only point I would add to that, Chairperson, is you mentioned the question of youth. We have, in terms of the PERO, had a very useful and quite innovative engagement with the Children's Commissioner, with young teenagers, around economic data in the province and what they want to see, what the questions they're asking, and trying to explain to themselves the economic world around them. And so, I think, as always, we're looking for ways to explain dynamics, economic dynamics, and fiscal dynamics as clearly as possible to everyone. That's our commitment, so that we can collectively make the right choices and understand why we're making difficult choices when it comes to the limited resources that we have available. Let me just ask Annalise to cover the final question on the compensation spending.
Yes. Thank you, Chair. So the follow-up question essentially is that projected 248 million rand within the first 6 months of a financial year a norm? So essentially that is the question. So the answer is no. One of the reasons is because in terms of the COVID assumptions that was made at the beginning of the year, is they're not the reality. That's the main driver of that under expenditure. So no, it's not the norm.
Thank you so much. I have my own theories regarding the teenage pregnancies in the Central Karoo. And I'm not long enough in Beaufort to be able to know what those are in Beaufort, but in Laingsburg, the teenage pregnancies, and you can go speak to the supervisor of the hospital, increased with the entry of the wind farms. More of the experts from other areas, because Laingsburg does not have capacity for those type of experts from other provinces or other persons, that came in, contractors, started working there, and what happened? The prostitutes increased. The prostitutes were younger women. So in Laingsburg specifically, that was the teenage pregnancies. And then what also happened is, because of various different criminal matters and trucking and all of those things, kind of pushed a lot of the teenage pregnancies to Toes River, because the stops where you start picking people up became different. So then it's not necessarily that there aren't teenage pregnancies, you're just displacing where, in which district and which municipality it is from. I'm not too aware about what the reasons are in Beaufort, but Beaufort also has an increase of wind farms coming. So I'm not sure whether that might be a contributing factor. Colleagues, with that, I'm just going to ask that we just stay behind online and in person so we can just adopt the report on the Municipal Economic Review, which shouldn't be too long. I want to thank the department and the minister. I know she has to run to another engagement. I just want to thank the department for the amount of work that you put into the Mero. I'm not blind to the fact that you've put extra information on slide 31 that we've asked previous. I'm not blind to the fact that for the first time you're inviting the service providers to sit in should you have extra questions on world-class reports. Reports that should be informing our data, should be informing our decision making. And I just want to say thank you, because I honestly don't think people realize how much work the provincial treasury does. And when you go back, please don't be like the carpenter that doesn't build its own house properly. Please do look after the staff and employees in your department, because the type of expertise and capacity that you have I think it's unrivaled. Thank you so much. Please go home to your families. The committee will now deal with its own committee business. Dr. Haverman, would you like to keep
one more
everyone
comment to make. We didn't discuss infrastructure too much today, but today I think is the last budget committee sitting for Mr. Klaas Langenhoven, who's retiring at the end of the year. So I just wanted to.
Congratulations. I hope you have an absolutely amazing retirement. Please go eat, pray, love somewhere. And when you do, think of us. I thank you so much for the work that you've been doing through the department. I mean, Provincial Treasury might be one of the smallest budgets, but it's also one of the biggest beasts in the Western Cape government. And to be able to find people with financial and economic and technical skills to work in a Provincial Treasury, it's gold. It's rarer than gold. Thank you so much. Wonderful. Okay, so while Member Fry makes his way back to his chair, we are going to now deal with the draft report on the Municipal Economic Review and Outlook 2022. Ms. Kalmish Ahmed, if you could put the draft report up. As usual, we do not need to support or object to the Mero. We simply note its tabling before us. And I do encourage all chairpersons to take the respective parts that is relevant to their committee and to interrogate and engage on them. I think there's a lot of information here that can inform what we do in the provincial government and how we do oversight. Wonderful. So the draft report reads as follows. The report of the Budget Committee, having considered the Municipal Economic Review and Outlook 2022, PR 303/2022, which is simply the reference dated 24 November 2022, as follows. The Budget Committee reports that it convened on 24 November 2022 and has concluded its deliberations on the Western Cape Government Municipal Economic Review and Outlook 2022, PR 303/2022, referred to it. If I could have a mover for the report, please. Member Murray and Member Mackenzie, thank you so much. The report is so adopted. This does not mean that we're never going to engage on Mero again. If there's anything specific we would like the Provincial Treasury to unpack, members are welcome to send in those respective matters. Colleagues, because I know that there are some who still need to go feed their children and so on, I would like to ask that we just keep our minutes for the next Budget Committee meeting, which will be the morning of the 29th of November, where we will also deal with the adjustment budget. From here on, we will now refer the adjustment budget to the respective committees, the respective departmental votes. Once those committees have deliberated and concluded and voted and adopted their reports on the adjustment budget, it will come back to the Budget Committee, where we will consider the adjustment budget in its totality on Tuesday. Ms. Kamish Ahmed, have I forgotten anything?
No.
Bye, dankie. With that, colleagues, I hope you have a lovely evening further. Thank you for remaining online with us until the very end. Good night. Stay warm. The meeting's adjourned.
Thank you, Chairperson, and everybody in the House.